All right. My name is Angel Lawver. I'm with the Institute for Humane Studies. For those who aren't familiar with IHS, we are the leading institute dedicated to championing classical liberal ideas and the scholars who advance them. Since 1961, the Institute for Humane Studies has been working to promote discussion and debate of classical liberal ideas in higher education. We have always defended the belief that good ideas flourish in a free and open intellectual marketplace, in which every idea is subject to intense scrutiny and criticism, and where participants recognize each other as fellow truth seekers deserving of tolerance and respect. Before we begin, I want to remind everyone that speakers do not represent one viewpoint, nor do they necessarily endorse the way in which IHS interprets and defends the liberal tradition. One thing is certain, however, all of us here believe in a robust defense of free speech. We hope that our discussion will challenge and enlighten as we explore these important themes with conviction, respect, and humility. Not to ignore the elephant in the room, but you may have noticed a few changes from the schedule and what's been promoted for this debate. Professor Bryan Caplan is still here to defend the capitalist position. Unfortunately, we have lost our original defender of socialism. We are instead joined by the lovely and accomplished Elizabeth Bruenig. And the weather has prevented our original moderator, Brandon Turner, from making it to DC, but I'm very pleased to be joined by our moderator for the afternoon, Dr. Emily Chamlee-Wright. And one small logistical piece, the Q&A session for this will be occurring in the continuing conversation room in Marriott 2, so stay tuned for both speakers' Q&A sessions there. And with that, I'll introduce our moderator. Dr. Chamlee-Wright joined the Institute for Humane Studies in November 2016 with an accomplished record as an academic leader, scholar, and educator. From 2012 to 2016, she served as the provost and dean at Washington College and was previously the Albert H. Neese Professor of Economics and Associate Dean at Beloit College. Emily earned her PhD in economics from George Mason University and has published 6 books. She is a former W.K. Kellogg National Leadership Fellow and received the Excellence in Teaching Award from Beloit College, a Distinguished Alumna Award from George Mason University, and the 2014 Charles G. Koch Outstanding IHS Alum Award. With that, please help me welcome our moderator.
Thank you, Angel. It is my pleasure to be here this afternoon. We'll try and work on that. It's my pleasure to be here this afternoon, and on behalf of IHS, I want to thank Students for Liberty and all of you for joining us today. Without further ado, let me introduce our debaters this afternoon. Elizabeth Bruenig is an opinion columnist with the Washington Post, where she writes on issues related to Christianity, politics, and public life. And previously, she served as an editor to the Post's Outlook and Post Everything sections, and she served as a staff writer for the New Republic. Liz earned her Master's of Philosophy at the University of Cambridge in the study of Christian theology, where she studied as a Marshall Scholar. Her essays and reviews appear in The Post, The Nation, The Atlantic, the Boston Review, Jacobin Magazine, and First Things. Please join me in welcoming Elizabeth Bruenig. It's also my pleasure to introduce Bryan Caplan. He's professor of economics at George Mason University. He also is a blogger on the site EconLog. His book, The Myth of the Rational Voter, was named Best Political Book of the Year by the New York Times. He is also author of Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids and The Case Against Education. Currently, he's working on a project called All Roads Lead to Open Borders. It's a nonfiction graphic novel exploring the philosophy and social science behind immigration. His work appears in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the American Economic Review, Economic Journal, the Journal of Law and Economics. He has been featured on ABC News, Fox News, MSNBC, and C-SPAN. Please join me in welcoming Professor Bryan Caplan. As Angel noted, this afternoon's session is going to be structured in debate style. We have 10 minutes of an opening statement from each. We'll start with Professor Kaplan, then move to Ms. Bruenig. And then each will have 5 minutes as a rebuttal. And we'll have a short opportunity for me to ask questions. And if there is time, they'll be able to ask some questions of each other as well. And I'll be the timekeeper. I know that there are a lot of fans of liberty out there in the room. This is not a regime that is what I would call egalitarian. I will be dictatorial in my moderating responsibilities. I will have a command and control paradigm to cut people off exactly when their time is up. So I hope that the interlocutors here will not be startled if I have to stop them prematurely from finishing their last thought. So with that, I'm going to turn to Professor Kaplan. Your opening remarks, please.
Capitalism and socialism, what do these words even mean? You could just say that capitalism is the economic system of countries like the United States, and socialism is the economic system of countries like the former Soviet Union. In that case, I'd say that capitalism is at least okay, while socialism is terrible, and perhaps my opponent would even agree. It's more fruitful, though, to treat capitalism and socialism as positions on the ideal economic system. It's something like the capitalist ideal is the government plays very little role in the economy, and the socialist ideal is the government plays a leading role in the economy. In that case, I say that capitalism is awesome and socialism is terrible. What is so awesome about the capitalist ideal? It's a system based upon individual freedom and voluntary consent. You're allowed to do what you want with your own body and your own stuff. If other people want to cooperate with you, they need your consent. If you want to cooperate with other people, you need their consent. Can consent really be voluntary if some people want more often than others? Absolutely. Some people are vastly more attractive than others. This does nothing to undermine the voluntariness of dating. Under capitalism, how people use their freedom is up to them. They can try to they can relax, they can help the poor, all three, or none of the above. Society by consent. Capitalism is such a compelling moral ideal that I'm tempted to rest my case right now. But there is a looming doubt. Is capitalism one of those ideals that sounds wonderful but works terribly in real life? How can we even begin to answer such a sprawling question? Here's my approach. Start by looking at the most capitalist countries that actually exist. Next, weigh the probable effects of the main policy reforms necessary to bring those countries into harmony with the capitalist ideal. By usual rankings, the most capitalist countries in the world are Hong Kong and Singapore. Other exemplars include the United Kingdom, Canada, and the United States. By world and historic standards, all are incredibly rich and pleasant countries. This was not true for Hong Kong or Singapore back in 1950, but after decades of top rankings, they are two of the richest and most pleasant countries on Earth. All these countries still have some relatively poor people, but there is very little absolute poverty. Indeed, the poor in these countries have such a nice life that people around the world eagerly immigrate there to work in hard, low-skilled jobs. The reason is clear. Free markets channel the fundamental human desire to better oneself in socially productive ways. If you can deliver a product that people like at a price they find attractive, you get rich. This doesn't just lead to mountains of cheap, amazing products. It also leads to constant innovation, a ceaseless effort to do more with less. Of course, most of us are not huge successes in business. But since businesses compete for both consumers and workers, most of the benefits ultimately go to us. Amazon has got to be the best store in the history of the world, but its lifetime profits sum to only a few billions. In exchange, we just get a cornucopia of cheap and convenient products. Now to repeat, none of the world's most capitalist countries actually live up to the capitalist ideal, but still provides a useful benchmark. How is the status quo likely to change if government's role drastically shrinks? All right, I've only got time for the highlights. First, even the most capitalist countries heavily restrict immigration. Non-citizens need government permission to live and work there, and such permission is almost impossible for most people on Earth to attain. If these laws were repealed, there would be massive international migration. People around the world would move from countries where their labor produces little to countries where the labor produces much. A standard long-run estimate is that this would double the production of the world and drastically reduce global poverty and inequality in the process. Second, Even the most capitalist countries tightly regulate construction, especially in high-wage areas. If these laws were repealed, there would be a massive increase in the supply of housing in the most prosperous areas of the country, soon followed by massive intra-national migration. Standard estimates of even modest housing deregulation say it would raise US GDP by 10%, and again, markedly reduce poverty and inequality in the process. 3, even the most capitalist countries engage in massive involuntary income redistribution. Strangely, however, most of this redistribution targets not the poor, but the old. If these laws had never existed, a large majority of people would simply have taken care of their own retirement, and that would be much easier because taxes would be so much lower that savings would be easier. What about the minority who can't take care of themselves? It would cost so little compared to the status quo that it is not unreasonable to leave it to private charity. But if that sounds like wishful thinking, we can just retain a small welfare state for poor children and the severely handicapped. 4, even the most capitalist countries heavily subsidize education. In my new book, The Case Against Education, $20 on Amazon, I argue that the main effect of these subsidies is not to prepare people for good jobs, but to spark fruitless credential inflation. If these laws were repealed, we'd still be literate and numerate, but become independent and self-supporting years earlier. What about poor kids? Again, my preferred answer is private charity. But if that's not good enough for you, then a means-tested voucher program does solve the problem. Right now, what is so terrible about the socialist ideal? It's a system based on government authority and coercion. Now, to be fair, democracy is a decent way to mitigate the mass murder and slavery typical of socialist dictatorships. But even under democratic socialism, the individual is at the mercy of popular opinion, and popular opinion is not pretty. Just look at the shameful way American democracy treats peaceful immigrants like criminals, to popular acclaim. Socialists like to compare the ideal society to a family. But in actual families, you don't have to support your siblings if you don't want to. You don't even have to support the parents who gave you life. So why should your moral obligations to complete strangers be any stronger? The idea that the rich are morally obliged to give away everything they don't need until poverty has been vanquished has some superficial appeal. But objectively speaking, all of us have vastly more than we need, especially if you remember the market value of your free time. You guys could be making money right now and giving it to other people who need it, but you're not. All right. Now, I loathe hyperbole, but if a socialist government really enforced the obligation to give away all your surplus to the poor, you would literally be a slave. Once again, though, there is the looming doubt. Is socialism one of those ideals that sounds terrible but works wonderfully in real life? To resolve this, I again suggest my same two-step procedure. First, start by looking at the most socialist countries that actually exist. Next, weigh the probable effects of the main policy reforms necessary to bring these countries into harmony with the socialist ideal. By the usual rankings, the world's most socialist countries are North Korea and Venezuela. No decent socialist upholds these hell states as ideals, and I'm certainly not accusing my opponent of doing so. There are many praiseworthy ways to bring relatively socialist countries into harmony with the socialist ideal, starting with stop murdering and jailing people to keep the ruling plutocrats in power. But as long as the North Korean and Venezuelan governments play the dominant roles in their economies, they'll remain impoverished and oppressive societies. How would democracy fix that, short of abandoning socialism? To be fair, if I were socialist, I would want to start with Sweden as my benchmark and work from there. But that's crazy. By most measures, Sweden is only modestly less capitalist than the United States. Now, people often mock socialists for insisting that true socialism has never been tried. I'm not going to say that, because I don't think that true capitalism has ever been tried. But if we want to forecast the likely effects of the true versions of either system, it makes sense to start with the closest existing approximations, then analyze the probable effects of bringing their policies into harmony with the ideals. When we do so, we see that capitalism is a wonderful ideal that's likely to work wonderfully in practice, and socialism is a terrible ideal that's likely to work terribly in practice. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Bruenig.
Thank you very much. Hope my hair doesn't get on my mic, because if you start hearing a bunch of scratching, that's what it is. I'd like to begin by thanking the Institute for Humane Studies for bringing me out to debate this fine Saturday, windy enough for you. And I'd like to thank Dr. Kaplan for agreeing to talk to me about things that are so important to us both, and to all of you for coming to listen. It's fairly easy, though no less a pleasure, to receive invitations to speak with and before people I'm all in agreement with. But it's a special privilege to receive the opportunity to present my thoughts and discuss them with people on the other side of the ideological divide. So as far as debates go, I'm a little bit out of practice. The last time I devoted considerable time to it was in high school, but I hope we can still have a provocative and maybe even entertaining session for you today. It seems fitting to me we should discuss these ideas at LibertyCon, as I do agree we are facing a crisis of liberty. The great authors of the Western tradition, the ancients, the late antique and medieval luminaries who laid out the foundations for what remains true and beautiful in our culture, would look at us today and see us as profoundly unfree. There is at first the greatest matter of interior unfreedom. In the Phaedrus, one of his Socratic dialogues, Plato had his mentor liken the human soul to a team of two winged horses led by their charioteer. The horse on the right is the nobler side, a lover of honor with modesty and self-control, companion to glory, needs no whip, is guided by verbal commands alone. Meanwhile, the horse on the left is a companion to wild boasts and indecency. He's shaggy around the ears, deaf as a post, barely yields to his horsewhip and goad combined. The bad horse, undisciplined and self-indulgent, is always dragging its poor yoke-mate and charioteer into a pathetic and immoral behavior. Its unbridled lust and greed and ravenous want and its domination of its team is the very definition of unfreedom. Nobody ruled by such appetites could be said to be truly free. Then there is the matter of exterior freedom. In politics, Aristotle considers the natural slave one who is, in the words of Greek philosophy scholar Joseph Karbowski, naturally suited to slavery, a human being who is by nature suited to be a piece of property that belongs to someone else and functions as a second-order tool for them, a way for them to achieve their means. That's a natural slave. That's what we all under capitalism are. St. John Chrysostom, the 4th century bishop of Constantinople, warned the rich of his day, the idle rich of his day, possessions are so called that we may possess them, not so that they may possess us. Why do you regard the master as a slave? Why do you invert the order? No longer is this inversion an affliction strictly of the rich. It now characterizes our entire social order. It's something of a shame now to see these greats peering down at us from the occasional courthouse pediment and cathedral niche. What would they make of us now? We're ruled by passions, owned by things. We've been taught that freedom is a vast blankness defined only by its featurelessness, and we spend our lives laboring at the behest of others in hopes of surpassing those nearest to us instead of cooperating with them. The story of how we got here is the story of the rise of capitalism. Consider the bondage of the will. Wherever the bourgeoisie has got the upper hand, Marx and Engels observed, it has drowned the most heavenly ecstasies of religious fervor, chivalrous enthusiasm, Philistine sentimentalism in the icy water of egotistical calculation. Capitalism demanded rationalization, the weighing and measuring and ordering and specifying of everything, not least because capitalism simply isn't possible without rigorous and extensive bookkeeping. The objective of capitalism is the generation of profit, and to maximize that end, it helps to be thoroughly, coldly calculating about things. It wasn't as though no one in the Western world had ever behaved in this way before. Rather, the late Christian socialist John Hughes wrote, "It is that this practice came to be differently evaluated, and this novel interpretation of capitalism as moral came to new dominance." So the spirit of morally neutral, self-interested utilitarianism came to displace all that had come before. Hughes noted that the spirit of modern capitalism appears to be utterly value-free, without substantive commitments. It's strictly procedural. It follows from its pure instrumentality that it's concerned with methods instead of goals, means, and not ends. Capitalism fosters an obsessive focus on one's interests, meaning one's material well-being, and argues that the pursuit of such is an unqualified moral good. It renders sustained contemplation for no other purpose than to know the truth, utterly useless and irrational, and largely impossible. It is preferable for capitalists that we do not spend much time shaping and educating our wills. And capitalism thrives on this state of affairs. You walk through a veritable gauntlet of products at several retailers just to pay, precisely because capitalists bank on your impulsiveness. Addiction works too, and serves as a simple permanent income scheme for capitalists who spend millions paying scientists to explain to them exactly how to make their products maximally addictive to you, to children. Even if you wanted to understand what it is you ought to want, what you ought to desire, the ethos of capitalism suggests that desire is purest and most authentic when unmediated, and thus more consumptive choices allow you to be more truly yourself. Paralyzing choices populate your inner life, and your will is alternately arrested and exploited. And yet capitalism claims to be the political economic form that most values free choice. The contradiction between the conditions on the ground and capitalism's self-image perhaps explains why, when you trace its ideological roots, so much time is spent trying to explain how people have consented to things they obviously haven't. John Locke claimed, for example, that by agreeing that gold and silver are valuable, we agree to the unequal distribution of wealth arising from the accumulation of capital. It's just silly. Thomas Hobbes said that you can still be understood to have consented to that which you were forced to do, even upon pain of death. All it means is that you chose life. Similar, hey buddy, you asked for this arguments arise in cases where there are no other choices readily available, as in the payment of poverty wages and unsafe, sexually abusive, or exploitive working conditions. The illusion of consent only emerges in this context to conceal the fact that the average person under capitalism does not really have much control over their economic activity, much less his or her own destiny. The basic fact of capitalism is the vast majority of people in society will work towards ends that are not their own, and in some cases barely even known to them. In these circumstances, the goal of the worker's activity is no longer immediately present in the actions they're doing, nor even partially inherent in them, but utterly extrinsic to them, and in some cases quite distant. Workers sell their labor, which, as Hegel pointed out in his philosophy of right, means nothing less than alienating the whole of my time as crystallized in my work and everything I produced, thus making into another's property the substance of my being, my whole personality, and in return receive a wage, essentially protection money to pay off other rentiers and commodity dealers for the use of the world. For workers, paradoxically, the fullest expression of their agency, offered under capitalism that is the full alienation thereof. Hugh Benyon put it aptly in his account of working for Ford. Workers are paid to obey. This is all obscure to us now, call it the mystification of capitalism, but has been remarkably clear to any number of great historical thinkers. Take Kant, for instance. The only qualification required by a citizen, Kant argued, apart from being an able-bodied male, is that he must be his own master and must have some property to support himself. In cases where he must earn his living from others, as most of us do, he must earn it only by selling that which is his and not by allowing others to make use of him. For he must, in the true sense of the word, serve no one but the commonwealth. For full participation in democracy, one must have the security of his own freedom, and wage laborers simply don't. Kant's analysis no longer describes our nominal circumstances, but remains entirely in the right as to the nature of the relationship between capital owner and worker. But it doesn't have to be this way. Socialism has a range of expressions, though it's mostly argued against in its rare 20th century historical forms. The effect of any strands I would advocate for would be at least fourfold: to decommodify labor in as many other domains of life as possible, to reduce or eliminate workers' alienation from their labor, society, and themselves, to reduce the vast social and political inequality brought about by capitalism, and to diminish or destroy capital's control over politics, society, and the economy. We already agree generally with the decommodification of certain goods. Education, for example, is largely decommodified. There's a major grassroots movement to decommodify healthcare. All this means is that to protect certain domains from total domination by market forces. The decommodification of labor, as my friend C.W. Strand has pointed out, leads to a circumstance in which one's livelihood, one's survival, or economic reproduction is no longer market dependent. Once labor is liberated from the pressures and caprices of the market, then the nature of the market itself changes. It ceases to be a realm of imperatives and becomes one of opportunities. It returns a person's creativity and agency and time to them. It removes the penalty, or lowers the cost, if you like, of contemplation. Reducing workers' alienation from their labor would be a knock-on effect of opening up the market to individual initiatives and creativity. It would also require that we enact legal protections for organized labor and that state respect and foster such organization. These processes, along with a more general process of decommodification across the board, will reduce social and personal alienation by transforming the overwhelmingly competitive impulse in capitalist society to a cooperative impulse. It's worth noting, I think, that this is a goal that sounds unreasonably optimistic only because capitalism sells us the worst possible story about ourselves, imagining human nature as inherently greedy, jealous, destructive, and antisocial. That's another way in which our own liberation to excellence is foreclosed to us by capitalism. Breaking capital's stranglehold on politics and society could require any number of legal and regulatory approaches, and could also include the voluntary participation of workers' organizations and councils in directing the resources of their firms towards collaborative, positive, pro-social projects. These four fronts are only a rough sketch of the sort of socialism I envision. My purpose here was to debate the merits rather than supply particularly policy parameters, which can be left to more talented policymakers than I. But the moral case is important. It's primary, even. With regard to certain practices and industries, socialists may claim that socialist-style approaches will result in greater utility or efficiency. And in some cases, they're right. As far as I can tell, like I said, it's not my specialty. But the greatest recommendation of socialism is that it is its own moral case, and this is nowhere clearer than in contexts where freedom is held among the highest values. The chief advantage that was a result from the establishment of socialism is undoubtedly the fact that socialism would relieve us from the sordid necessity of living for others, which, in the present condition of things, presses so hardly among almost everybody, Oscar Wilde wrote. For Wilde, socialism opened onto an ever more perfect individualism. For me, it opens onto the possibility not of living strictly for ourselves, but living for human excellence, for our own common good. Thank you.
We now turn to Professor Kaplan for the 5-minute rebuttal.
So in listening to Elizabeth's remarks, I really have to say that Orwell just keeps coming up over and over. So here's the thing. It's very tempting to say that there's this very narrow view of human freedom that capitalism promotes, and there's a much better, more nuanced, subtler view that socialism has. But then there's the problem. When you make the view that broad, you wind up not only apologizing for, but actually requiring that you take away the more obvious kinds of freedom. So again, when you look at someone and say, look, he's just going and playing his video game, he's not really free. All right? Say, so what are we going to do? We're going to go and take away his video game from him, and then he'll be free, because then he's doing what he truly wants, which is not what he's actually doing, but what I think that he ought to want. A kind of strange language. Again, of course, if you want to go and start talking about what historic socialists said, so Marx, what did he have to say about religion? The whole problem, he said, is classical liberals are only concerned with giving people the freedom to pursue whatever religion they want. But real freedom would be liberation from the witchery of religion. I think that's Marx's word. All right, now, what does it mean to liberate people from the witchery of religion in practice? It means to shut down their churches and persecute them for practicing the religion, tell them they can't do it anymore. Now, you might say, well, now that's real freedom. But again, this is just the kind of thing that George Orwell was talking about. He said, look, you're wrong. The normal, simple, naive view is the right view. And your view is a gigantic rationalization for oppression. Right? And ultimately, I have to think that is what is going on here. If we, let's see. Yeah, so again, the idea that there is an illusion of consent when someone goes and buys a product. How is that an illusion? It is the primary example of consent. When I went and bought some French fries at McDonald's today, how is there any clear case of consent other than for someone to say, well, in a truly free society, you wouldn't want those fries? It's like, well, first of all, I would, but second of all, this just seems like you want to go and use this language that naturally appeals to people of freedom to go and justify exactly the opposite. And I don't know why anyone else would be willing to go along with it. And of course, if you're planning on being someone who is on the bureau to decide what counts as true freedom, I can understand the appeal. But if you plan on being on the other side of it, very different matter. But now, when I was going and reading about Elizabeth's views, I actually found a lot to sympathize with. So I guess you didn't mention Catholic socialism, but there's a lot of things I like about it, especially things like being concerned about the rights of immigrants. But now, here's the thing. If you start seeing oppression in the purchase of French fries, and you think about that a lot, it is easy to be distracted when you are faced with problems that are much more serious, such as an immigrant can't legally go and buy French fries, right? Illegal immigrant, right? Or more specifically, there are a lot of people that the United States government says are not legally allowed to live here or work here. Now, that is what I call real oppression. That is where you need a government piece of paper to go and live where you want, to go and rent an apartment from a willing landlord, to go and get a job from a willing employer. That's real oppression. So again, I would think that, that the Catholic socialists would still want to prioritize or triage and say, look, we can go and argue about whether someone is really free when they're buying us off on Amazon after we have first given everyone the right to get a job from a willing employer, right? After people are no longer told that it's illegal for them to live in what countries they want to live in. So, not only is there this strange effort to turn what's a normal definition of freedom into some kind of horrible oppression, but this also then winds up driving out thought of actual real problems in the world, right? So, Again, I mean, as I said, I would not accuse Elizabeth of being a supporter of Venezuela. I have no sign that she is. But again, it just seems very odd to go and complain about the horrible oppression of capitalism and not look at Venezuela and say, well, that seems kind of like they were trying to do the kind of thing I'm talking about, right? And maybe they went about it the wrong way, but nevertheless, does seem like people saying the market is oppressive and we're going to go and save you from all of that, and then the end result is people starving. So we'll leave it there.
Great, thank you. Liz Bruenig, 5 minutes for your rebuttal.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to start with the Ned Case. So when Professor Kaplan was building his case, he said that government authority and coercion are the main drivers of a socialist economy. The issue is that government authority and coercion are also the main drivers of capitalism. He talked about using your own body and your own stuff. Well, your own stuff is begging the question. What property belongs to you is actually defined by the government and their property law and enforced in their property law, and it's not yours if they say it's not yours. This is why your tax money literally, legally doesn't belong to you. And so obviously you're already relying on the government very strongly to enforce property law and enforce contracts and make the whole private economy work. The government is a very powerful and very central agent in that. That's why liberalism required the centralization and empowerment of states. They were decentralized and scattered before. They were much weaker before liberalism. States had to really beef up for capitalism, and they're stronger than they've ever been before because they have to support capitalism, and it takes a lot of muscle power. Individuals at the mercy of popular opinion is often brought up in cases where we're talking about socialism. I find it very funny. Why are you dressed like you're at a debate tournament? Well, because they want to be able to market this to people who might hire you. You want to look like young professionals. You don't want to wear the clothes you're wearing. You have to wear the clothes you're wearing because your employer wants you to wear them. Your future employers find it very attractive when people dress in a certain way and not when they dress in another way. This can extend to culturally different clothing. This can also just be the stuff that you feel most comfortable in. And the same thing with what you post on social media. You better be careful. You better watch out. Don't post anything on Facebook or Twitter. Your whole life is constricted by what capital wants out of you. You have to be careful all the time, not to say or do the wrong thing lest you get in trouble, unless you want to escape to academia or something and not make a lot of money. Why should moral obligations to your neighbor, which is also what I did, why should your moral obligations, this is something interesting that came up, why should your moral obligations to your neighbor supersede those to who you're even closely related, Dr. Kaplan asked. And I think this is a very important point. We are the most honorless, pathetic, immoral, sad creatures under liberalism, saying that we have no obligation to support our brothers and sisters, much less our mothers and fathers. If my kid ever talks to me that way, I'm going to become a very totalitarian socialist. You absolutely have an obligation to support your family members. This was well understood in the ancient world and all the way through the medieval period. Liberalism totally shattered this, of course, but it made us poorer and weaker for it. Surplus to the poor equals you're a slave was another point that came up. What about surplus to your capitalists, right? I mean, like someone's always taking your product of your labor away from you and your surplus away from you. The poor are certainly a better recipient of it than rich, right? I mean, so that would immediately tilt you towards socialism. And I would like to agree that if Sweden is only modestly less capitalist to the US and it's acceptable to Professor Kaplan, let's do it. I'm all for it, ready to go. We can both affirm that. And that can be the goal that we take away from this debate, is that we all need to move towards a democratic socialist model like Sweden. Now, responding to Professor Kaplan's rebuttal, Orwell came up, apologizing and for requiring the more obvious kinds of oppression in pointing out more obscure ones. But I don't think addiction is a particularly obscure kind of oppression. It's why employees of Facebook and other social media sites come out now and try to talk to people about the way that their products are made to make it difficult for you not to use them. You might say that's fair game, but it sounds to me like someone's trying to manipulate your will. And if you think your will is your pre-existing unmediated desire, which again is actually not my position. But if that's the way you want to view it, then these kinds of addictions are definitely manipulations and abuses of your will. Not to mention the stuff that your boss can make you do while you're at work. Basically anything, right? I mean, that's what it is. You're paid to obey. Professor Kaplan brought up Marx on religion. Marxists want to shut down churches and persecute them. Capitalism actually did one better in that it completely destroyed any type of faith, right? So what capitalism left behind is this kind of brittle Protestant, there's a God, I guess. It's very weak. Because tradition was the main barrier for capitalism. This is what Weber points out, right? The main thing that capitalism had to overcome were traditional ways of living, and that meant religion. It didn't openly say we're shutting down your churches and stopping you from worshiping. It just changed the type of worship that took place to where now it's basically a civil religion type thing. This is what Rousseau imagined. And it's very, very different than what came all before it. In terms of immigration and whether this debate is crowding out discussions that we could be having about immigration, I didn't know it was going to be about immigration. It was set up as capitalism and socialism. But I assumed that we were talking about sort of the relations between capital and workers and the political economy. And so that's why I set it up that way. Tentatively, it sounds all good on immigration. It sounds like we'd all be good. I mean, capital can move all around the world, so people should be able to as well, or you've got to stop capital. But that's another way in which capital makes you less free. Thank you.
So now it's my turn. I have a question for Liz Bruenig. Excuse me, let me cancel this. So you write and you spoke today about the connection between time-honored religious principles, moral principles, and our obligation to the poor. And the power of this argument, it seems to me, is that there is an opportunity for us to become more moral beings by serving the poor. But it seems to me that there's an essential ingredient in that calculus that says that it is our actions that are freely chosen that allows us to become more moral beings because we are serving the poor. So here's my question. Why abandon persuasion? Right? You so persuasively argue in favor of our moral obligation to the poor. As soon as we use a state apparatus to operationalize that morality, we strip away the morality because now we are depending upon the coercive power of the state. How do you respond?
So I would go in two directions. For one, I would recommend considering the expressive powers of law, right? So laws don't just coerce, they teach you about what is good and what is considered right by your countrymen. There's been quite a lot written on the expressive powers of law, so having laws that actually enshrine care for the poor and care for the weakest and most vulnerable in society actually teach you that that's right and good. The second issue is that this conflation between charity and welfare is a very modern thing, and it's also incorrect theologically. The medievals, for instance, very Christian medieval Europe, they recognized the difference between what they would consider like state maintenance, just maintaining order in society by making sure people aren't dying of poverty in the streets and so on, rioting because of their poverty, and then charity. Caritas, the Latin for charity, was not used to mean almsgiving for a very, very long time. Augustine didn't really closely identify caritas and almsgiving. That came along much later in the Middle Ages. So caritas and charity, people do need to be persuaded into that, but it's not as simple as throwing money at people, and it shouldn't be. And in fact, I think the government taking up, or workers' collectives or mutual aid societies, or however you want to sort it out, I think those organizations taking up welfare, maintenance, keeping people at an existence minimum, a good floor for flourishing, only opens up more opportunities for charity to take on even more nuanced and interpersonal forms, right? Charity should be about the corporal works of mercy, for instance. People used to finance weddings, they used to finance funerals. Those are very nice and lovely things to do. Also just being with people, spending time with them, devoting your attentions and energies to them appears to be pretty close to the original sense of charity. So I don't think it's crowded out by welfare, and the medieval example would suggest that it hadn't been. In fact, tithes in the Middle Ages were collected by force. So the charity at that time was not totally delineated from welfare, but you can see in the canonists that they're thinking very differently about the two things.
Thank you. Professor Kaplan, in their defense of markets, free market economists criticize government interference that protects already existing industries. And we tend to call that crony capitalism, and we are opposed to it. And I know that you've written on this, I've written on this. But others have argued that crony capitalism is not just a sometimes phenomenon, it is a systemic and predictable outcome of capitalism, that as soon as we get wealth accumulation within the hands of a few industrialists, they will conspire against the public and use the state apparatus of coercion to have their will fulfilled. So is it not disingenuous for us to say that we like capitalism, and we just don't like this other thing called crony capitalism, without really dealing with the question of whether or not crony capitalism is a systemic and predictable outcome of capitalism.
So I'd say the first thing to remember is capitalists invest in trying to influence government policy when they think it can work. So there's no corporation in the U.S. currently trying to have all the Social Security budget handed over to it. Right? And why not? Why does General Motors not say, you know, there's a lot of money in Social Security, why don't you give it to us? They know that's hopeless, right? The reason why businesses try to lobby the government is they try to find things that might actually go through, right? Now I have a book, The Myth of the Rational Voter, which goes over a lot of evidence along these lines, and there's big literature in political science as well. I mean, basic point is that even in countries that are moderately democratic, it's very unusual for governments to do things that are very unpopular. Instead, government, you have special interests want to get anything done, they need to go and find something that at least the public doesn't care about very much, right? So, I would say that there has been big variation in what the public actually cares about. There have been times when people would have thought that it was terrible for government to go and seize property, to go and hand it over to a private developer. Other times when people think it's okay. There are times when people would have thought it's ridiculous to say you can't build a skyscraper on a vacant lot, and other times where people think that's just fine. So again, I would always go and basically put the blame back down on ideas and say that lobbying, while it's important, is basically just hammering out the details. And like the model where the main thing that democracy does is do what corporations tell them to do is not true. And I'll say this, whether or not I actually think government is doing something bad. Again, the actual evidence that corporations are behind any big policies. Again, if you're running a business, you could either go and say, let's have a fundamental change in policy, or you could say, how about you give me a special tax subsidy for this? And again, that's normally what businesses do, is they just try to work on something that's easy and that nobody cares about. So again, I would just say that, so I think crony capitalism exists because the public wants a government big enough to do a lot of the things that are popular, right? And again, then I just add on my view that what's popular is bad, as usual.
Great. So we have just enough time, I think, for each of our participants here in this debate to ask each other one question. I'll turn to Professor Kaplan.
Oh, I forgot about that.
Would you like to start?
All right, sure. So, which is the least bad government that was actually run by socialist dictatorship, and why?
Let's see.
What's your least despised socialist dictatorship?
Oh, I'm really big on 13th century France. So, I mean, but, judging by the principles that I'm working off of in terms of defining socialism, to be one of those nice Carolingian dynasties. But again, I don't advocate for dictatorship. I'm a democratic socialist. We can do a really fun dictatorship versus democracy argument later. But either one of those you can also have, for instance, state capitalism, and you can have dictatorships and capitalism. That's been a really popular fascist approach, is to have a little dictatorship and a nice capitalist system. So, you can really switch it up any which way. The dictatorship element isn't very important to me. And I think you could even find better people to argue for the really powerful monarchist position than me. There's certainly those among the Catholics who would take you up on that opportunity. In terms of, so do I need to sort of generate a question here?
Yes, that's your turn now.
Okay, let me think for a minute. How does a thing come to be yours?
How does a thing come to be yours?
In the state of nature, how do I acquire something and it becomes absolutely my property?
Right. Good question. So first of all, I would never say absolutely. Absolutely never say absolutely, right? So, if my baseball is required to save the universe, then I say it's not, then it's not absolute. How do things normally come to be yours?
Wait, why wouldn't it be absolutely yours if it was required to save the universe?
Pardon?
Why wouldn't it be yours if it was required to save the universe?
So why not? So what do you? So. All right.
Let's let him answer the first question that you posed.
Right.
Sorry.
So on that, here's what I would say. So I say there's a general moral principle that there's a presumption in favor of leaving people and their stuff alone, and if you need to save the universe, that's strong enough to overcome the presumption. All right, now as to how something becomes your own, just say that It is not hard for us to tell this under normal circumstances. If one person shows up on an island and builds a hut and then another person washes up and say, that's my hut too, no one has any big trouble going and saying, no, it's not. That's the person might want to be nice and let you stay in their hut, but it's not theirs. What I would say is we start off with the paradigmatic case of your own body, right? And say, like, well, how is it that your body comes to be yours? And, well, seems like you shouldn't go around touching other people's bodies without their consent. And then if a person's using their body to go and build something or make something that's been unowned, that doesn't seem like a problem. And then if you can go back and track it down further, say, well, so how do you get these items? Well, from another person. Where do they get them? Well, they're from another person. How do they get them? The right way. So again, I would just say that this is the usual case where to come up with a general algorithm is neither possible nor necessary, because moral intuition is more than enough, right? And by the way, so if you are curious, so there is only one libertarian philosophy book that I swear by, and that is Mike Huemer's The Problem of Political Authority. I'll take that one over all the others together. So it'll be my Bible, as it were.
Thank you very much.
This brings us right to the end of our time here. I'd like to close by saying what an extraordinary display of what it looks like to exercise discursive ethics. Right? When we are exercising discursive ethics, we are fundamentally recognizing the dignity of the other person. We're recognizing that they may have something to teach us, even if we come to the conversation with deep commitments of our own. They may point out little fault lines in our own argument, even if they don't persuade us 100% to go over to their position. And most importantly, it's this idea that knowledge is always, always, always something that grows. And it grows when we come together and we share our best ideas and let the bright lights of scrutiny shine their light on what it is that we have to say, but also our interlocutors have to say. And that is really the magic of coming together in a session like this. So I want you to be join me in thanking our interlocutors here, but I also want to thank you because you've played a role in this as well by listening carefully and sympathetically to these two sides. So let's all give you a round of applause as well as our interlocutors.